The last will. A web of lies and deceit. You are a disgrace to this family, Clara hissed, her icy voice cutting through the thick air of the room as she slammed the door behind me. Her hands, trembling with fury, pushed me further into the hallway, as if trying to rid herself of the very sight of me. I could barely register the sting of her words before the weight of them settled into my chest. I wasn't welcome here anymore, but little did she know, today was the day everything would change. I stood in the middle of my childhood home, my heart pounding in my ears, while Clara's angry shouts echoed from downstairs. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, the place I once called home now foreign and hostile. I was packing up the few belongings I had left, each item another reminder of a life I was forced to leave behind. But as I stuffed my clothes into a duffel bag, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction bubbling up inside me. Clara didn't know the truth. She didn't know that my father, even in his last days, had made sure the mansion would never truly belong to her. He had signed everything over to me in secret, ensuring that when the time came, I would be the one standing here, ready to serve her the eviction notice she never saw coming. My fingers tightened around the handle of my bag, the anger from earlier still simmering in my veins. There was no going back. Today, I wasn't just leaving the house. I was taking back what was mine. As I rifled through the clutter of my old childhood room, the weight of my past bearing down on me, something stopped me in my tracks. Amid the mess of old books and forgotten trinkets, a photo frame caught my eye. I dusted it off carefully, the edges worn from years of being tucked away. The picture was from 6 years ago, a time when life was simple, before the sickness, before Clara, before everything changed. In the photograph, my father, my sister Emma, and I stood by the lake house, grinning from ear to ear. It was the kind of moment you look back on and wish you could freeze forever. We were happy, so happy, with no idea that everything was about to unravel. I remember that day vividly, the sun casting a warm glow over the water, our laughter mixing with the sound of the breeze. But now it felt like a different lifetime. I stared at my father's smiling face, wishing I could go back to that moment. And yet, a sickening feeling crawled up my spine as I thought about the changes that came afterward, the changes I couldn't ignore anymore. His cancer diagnosis had been the catalyst. It had slowly begun to erode everything. And Clara? She had slipped in like a shadow, quietly worming her way into our lives, making herself indispensable. Before long, it wasn't just about her bringing us coffee during hospital visits or planning family dinners. It was more insidious than that. I remembered one night, not long after Dad had been diagnosed, when she suggested, almost casually, that she should take over his medical proxy. "I'm here every day anyway," she had said, her voice sweet, convincing. "It only makes sense." I'd been silent, watching the way my father, worn down by the treatments, simply nodded along. It wasn't just medical decisions. Clara soon had control of the family finances. "You need to focus on getting better, darling," she would say to my father, her tone syrupy sweet, while I stood there, uncomfortable, wondering how much longer he would let her pull the strings. And yet it all felt so natural. No one suspected a thing. But as I stood there, holding the photo, I could feel the sting of truth creeping in. My father had been slowly pushed aside, his decisions slowly being taken out of his hands by the woman he had married. The small changes added up over time until I couldn't deny it anymore. Clara wasn't here to care for him. She was here to take what she could. And it had all started so subtly, so carefully. I couldn't help but ask myself, how could I have missed it? I should have been more vigilant. Before I share what happened next, the moment that completely shattered everything I thought I knew about my own family, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had to fight to protect someone you love, hit that like button, because this story is just getting started. As I stood there, holding that photo in my hands, a quiet, unsettling realization started to dawn on me. I wasn't just fighting for the mansion anymore. I was fighting for the family that once was, and for the truth that Clara had tried so desperately to bury. The tension in the air was palpable as I drove my father to his treatment that day. It was supposed to be a routine visit, but something felt wrong. For weeks, Clara had been the one taking him to all his appointments, overseeing everything, as if she were the only one capable of caring for him. But that morning, for the first time in months, Dad asked me to take him instead. "Ryan," he said, his voice weaker than usual, but steady enough to hold my attention. "I need you to drive me today." The words hit me like a jolt of electricity. Why now? Why suddenly? Clara had always been the one, and her absence in this moment felt like a crack in the veneer of their perfect facade. I glanced at him, wondering if this was some sign, a subtle plea for help, or maybe I was just reading too much into it. As we drove, the silence between us felt heavier than usual. Then, in a voice laced with an urgency I hadn't heard in months, Dad turned to me and said, "Everything I've done, Ryan, everything I've done in the last year, it's all been for you and your sister. Promise me you'll remember that." His words haunted me. It was as if, in that moment, he was trying to tell me something more, something I didn't understand yet. The cryptic message stayed with me for days, gnawing at the back of my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. That night, I began to notice things I had overlooked before. The small, seemingly harmless changes that added up over time. The missed family dinners, the phone calls I couldn't hear, the way Clara subtly isolated my sister Emma and me from our father's life. It was like she was methodically working to erase us, to keep us out of the picture. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. But soon, it became clear that Clara had been manipulating every aspect of our family's life. From changing Dad's appointments without consulting us to taking complete control over the finances. It was all part of her plan. The following weeks were a blur of unsettling discoveries. Every time I tried to speak to Dad, Clara was there, always hovering, always controlling. I began to realize that the warm, caring stepmother I had once known was nothing more than a facade. Behind that mask, Clara was a master manipulator, and I had been blind to it for far too long. I couldn't stand it anymore. The anger, the frustration, it was all too much. I confronted her one evening when Dad was asleep, my fists clenched at my sides. "Clara," I spat, my voice trembling with rage. "I know what you've been doing. You've been isolating him, pushing Emma and me out of the picture. You've been controlling everything, haven't you?" For a moment, Clara's eyes widened in shock, but then the mask slipped. She leaned in, her smile cold and calculating, and whispered, "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Ryan." In that moment, I knew the battle had only just begun. The woman I had once thought was my ally was now my enemy, and the stakes were higher than ever. Dad's words echoed in my mind again. "Everything I've done has been for you and your sister." But what had he done? What had he left behind for us? I couldn't stop now. I had to find out what my father had known all along, and I had to make sure Clara's schemes didn't succeed. She had played her hand, but I was ready to play mine. Before I reveal what happened next, the shocking discovery that completely changed the course of everything, I want to ask you, have you ever felt like you were up against someone who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've ever had to stand up for what's right, smash that like button, because the truth is about to come out. The night I received the voicemail from my father was one I'll never forget. I was sitting alone in my apartment, my mind still racing from the confrontation with Clara earlier that day. My phone buzzed, and when I saw the unknown number, my heart skipped a beat. It was strange. My father's voice hadn't reached me in weeks. He'd been too tired, too distracted by Clara's presence. But this time I didn't hesitate. I pressed play. "Ryan." My father's voice crackled through the speaker, weak but unmistakable. "If you're hearing this, things have probably gotten worse, and I need you to know something. Everything I've done, it's been for you and Emma. I've made sure you'll be taken care of even after I'm gone. Clara doesn't know this, but I've already made arrangements. She can't undo it." I felt a chill wash over me as I listened. His voice was so distant, almost as if he were speaking from beyond the grave. But the message was clear. My father had planned ahead. He knew what Clara was capable of, and he'd taken steps to protect us. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Everything he had said, Everything he had done, it all started to make sense. He had known all along that Clara wasn't who she appeared to be. His words echoed in my mind. She can't undo it. The inheritance, the mansion, the life I thought would be stolen away from me, had already been secured in a way Clara could never touch. My father had outsmarted her, even from the grave. Determined to put his plan into motion, I drove straight to the house the next morning. The air was thick with tension as I entered, the walls still holding the memories of everything that had gone wrong. Clara was there, of course. She had always been there, watching, waiting. But today I wasn't afraid of her. Today I was armed with the truth. "Clara," I called out as I walked into the living room. Her eyes immediately narrowed, a mixture of annoyance and caution flashing across her face. She could sense something was different, but she had no idea what was coming. "You don't know what you're messing with," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "Oh, I think I do," I replied, my voice steady, unwavering. "I know everything, and you're not getting away with it." For the first time, I saw fear flicker in her eyes. It was brief, but it was enough. She wasn't as confident as she used to be. She had been playing a dangerous game, and now she realized that the tables were turning. I wasn't the naive son she had tried to manipulate. I was the one in control now. "Let me see my father," I demanded, my voice sharp. "I need to talk to him. Now." Clara's face contorted in frustration, her eyes wild with panic. She shook her head violently, her perfectly manicured hands shaking. "No, you can't," she snapped. "Your father doesn't want to see you. He's too sick. He doesn't need you here, especially now." But I wasn't backing down. I knew the truth now. I wasn't going to let her stand between me and my father any longer. "Clara," I said, my voice low but firm, "you can't keep hiding the truth. I know what my father did. And when this is all over, you'll be the one with nothing." She lunged at me, her face twisted in rage. "You think you've won, don't you?" she spat. "But this is just the beginning. You have no idea what you're really up against." And just like that, her mask slipped. The carefully crafted facade of the caring stepmother shattered in front of me. The woman I thought I knew was gone. In her place stood a ruthless, desperate stranger. Someone who would do anything to hold on to what she thought was hers. "You think you're so clever," she snarled. "But you don't know the whole story. I'm the one who's been holding this family together, not you." I stood my ground, refusing to let her intimidate me. "You were never part of this family," I said coldly. "And you never will be." The silence between us was deafening. It was the calm before the storm. Clara knew the truth would eventually come out, and she wasn't ready for that. With everything now in place, it was time to reveal the final blow. My father had arranged everything so carefully, legally binding, beyond Clara's reach. The inheritance wasn't just about the mansion. It was a carefully executed maneuver that protected Emma and me, ensuring that Clara could never take what wasn't hers. But I wasn't finished. The next move was mine to make. With a steady hand, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the document my father had left behind, proof of everything. It was time for Clara to see the consequences of her lies. Before I reveal how Clara tried to manipulate her way out of this, how the truth completely unraveled in front of her, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where the truth came out at the last moment, completely changing everything? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're ready for the moment of truth to unfold, hit that like button, because what happens next will change everything. The showdown had begun, and I was ready. The day had come, the final confrontation. I stood at the foot of the grand staircase, the eviction notice in my hand, my heart pounding with a mix of triumph and something deeper, something bittersweet. The family mansion, the place I had once called home, was about to change forever. But this wasn't just about the house. It was about honoring my father's legacy, protecting my sister, and finally exposing Clara for what she truly was. The room was filled with people, family friends, distant relatives, everyone who had been swayed by Clara's lies, everyone who had been part of her twisted web. But today they would see the truth. Clara stood in the center of the room, her usual air of confidence long gone, replaced by a nervous edge I hadn't seen before. Her eyes flicked around the room, searching for a way out, but there was no escape now. The truth had already caught up with her. "Clara," I said, my voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. "It's time everyone knew who you really are. I stepped forward and placed the eviction notice on the table in front of her, the bold letters cutting through the tension in the room like a knife. Clara recoiled slightly, her hands trembling as she reached for the notice, her face draining of color. But I didn't stop there. Everything you've done, manipulating my father, isolating me and my sister from him, stealing from this family, it's all here, I continued, pulling out the legal documents my father had arranged so carefully. The papers, forged by his love for Emma and me, confirmed the mansion's rightful ownership had already been transferred to me and Clara had no claim to it. My father had known this moment would come and he had prepared for it, protecting us even in death. Clara opened her mouth to protest, but I could see the cracks in her armor. The cold, calculating woman who had once tried to control every aspect of our lives was now cornered, exposed. The family members who had once supported her, who had been blinded by her charm and lies, were now watching her every move, their expressions shifting from disbelief to disgust. You can't do this, she sputtered, but her voice lacked conviction. The truth was too powerful, too undeniable. The web she had woven around us had unraveled in front of everyone, and now there was no place left for her to hide. One by one, the room fell silent. The shock of the moment was palpable. It felt like time itself had stopped. The people who had once trusted Clara began to murmur amongst themselves, the whispers growing louder. I looked at Emma standing by my side, her eyes wide but full of strength. We had been through so much together, and now we were finally reclaiming what was ours. Clara's facade had shattered, but there was still something more to be done. I turned to the lawyer who had been present in the room, Bo, my father's trusted friend. He stepped forward and handed Clara the final blow, the documents that sealed her fate. With them, all her manipulations and deceit were laid bare. There was nowhere for her to run. You're done, Clara, I said softly, but the weight of the words hung in the air. You'll never hurt anyone again. As Clara was escorted out of the mansion, her world crumbling around her, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. She had been the force that tore our family apart, but she was now nothing more than a shadow of her former self. The power she once held over us had been completely stripped away. With Clara gone, the house finally felt like a home again. I stood there in the middle of the grand living room and looked around. It was hard to believe how far we had come, how much we had fought for this moment. My father's love for us had transcended even death, his careful planning and sacrifice ensuring that Emma and I could move forward, stronger and more united than ever. The house, once filled with tension and fear, now echoed with the sound of new beginnings. Emma and I would restore the legacy our father had worked so hard to protect. We would rebuild what had been lost and make it ours again as a family. The scars left by Clara's betrayal would never fully fade, but we would carry our father's love and lessons with us every step of the way. As I stood by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't just about winning, it was about healing, about reclaiming what was rightfully ours and honoring the memory of a man who had loved us unconditionally. The past was behind us and the future was ours to shape. Before I end this chapter, I want to ask you, have you ever had to fight to rebuild what was broken? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've ever felt the strength to overcome a betrayal and start fresh, hit that like button because this journey may be over, but it's just the beginning for us. And as the door finally closed on Clara's dark chapter, I knew that Emma and I were ready to face whatever came next. Together.